Well, good evening and welcome to this first of a new series discussing vocation, Old Roman vocations. In the main, really with reference to the sacred ministry and the religious life. But also we may explore, and we will of course refer to various other aspects of general vocational discernment. Now, really, this series is in a response to a spate, as it were, of recent inquiries from many of you who are hopefully watching this episode, if not live, then hopefully later, but who have expressed an interest in exploring vocation within the Old Roman Catholic Church. Now, I should begin by saying in the first instance that rather like Christendom across the board, Old Romanism has experienced some fractions over the past century, so that this really what I'm going to discuss today is, and in this series, is vocations, particularly to the Orthodox Old Roman Catholic Communion, which is one of only a small handful of Old Roman jurisdictions in the world. And I should say that there are, at the moment, there is a great deal of work being done towards Old Roman unity. So that handful of jurisdictions are actually in negotiations, are in discussions at the moment, still at a very early stage, but looking very promising. And if only because on a regular basis, the relevant hierarchs are coming together in prayer. The last event was on the eve of Pentecost Sunday. And so that should be an indication of how close that work is becoming, which means that the present time is a very exciting time to be an Old Roman, and also a very exciting time to explore a vocation within the Orthodox Old Roman Catholic Communion and Old Romanism perhaps generally. Now, one of the things, there are several things, of course, that you may have as questions and queries concerning exploration and discernment and formation as an Old Roman sacred minister or religious. And the purpose of this series is really for you to ask those questions and receive answers. That's really the intention here. Because I'll be honest, we can't think of everything that everyone might want to know about exploring a vocation with us. We have a pretty good idea because most of us have been through that process. But we, we're open, as it were, to suggestions and other people's queries. So do feel free to write in or indeed to comment. And we will do our best to respond to your query or to your question. Now, one of the things I hope you already are familiar with is the Old Roman Communion's website. Now, I'll just bring it up here to show you. So this is the Orthodox Old Roman Communion website. This is accessible via oldcatholic.org or oldromancatholic.faith. Those are the two main website addresses or URLs that will lead you to this particular website. And what I intend to do is to go through the relevant formation pages or discernment pages of this website, because in the first instance, this really ought to be your first point of call when researching and to express an interest in discerning your vocation with us. Now, of course, one of the things to remember is that vocational discernment is an ongoing process, Indeed, even those who have been ordained and are actively serving are still engaged in ongoing vocational discernment. In the same way, too, that those who are retired are also continuing vocational discernment. And that's because vocational discernment is essentially the ongoing process of trying to work out and apply oneself to what God is calling you to do. Vocation, of course, comes from vocare, and that means calling. And literally it means, as it were, an invitation, a sense of invitation and calling from God to the individual to fulfill his will and purpose for their life. God's will and purpose for your life. And what we want to ensure is that our discernment process enables you to discern God's will for you. And the important thing to remember here is very much that this discernment process is a partnership. It is a partnership. It begins, of course, with yourself. It begins with your own sense of calling, with your own suspicion that God is calling you to sacred ministry or to the religious life, and that he is calling you particularly to the old Roman Church. Now, when you express, notify and share with us and register with us that you have discerned that your vocation may be with us, then it's important to understand that from then on, it's a partnership in discerning. It's a partnership in discernment, both the church and yourself. Now, this is true across the board. This is true in a general way. Vocations, particularly to the sacred ministry, are a partnership discernment process. And just as the same with the religious life. Perhaps you have heard myself and Bishop Kelly, our bishop in Chicago, on a Saturday evening, talking about the spiritual life. And I think it was a couple of weeks ago then, I made the point of saying that, of course, with the religious life, when a postulant and a novice are going through their discernment within a religious community, as much as they are discerning whether or not that is the right place for them, so too, of course, is everybody else in the community also discerning whether or not they believe that this person is the right fit for them, that this is the right place for them to realize their vocation. Because it can be disastrous, of course, if somebody joins a community, and communities particularly these days tend to be small, if somebody joins whose personality is totally at odds with everybody else, or whose manner or being or attitude is completely at odds with everyone else, it's going to be very difficult to create a sense of peace and harmony, which is what you want in a religious community, especially to be conducive to prayer and fraternity. So, but in a similar way with the church, not quite in such a same way, but in a similar way within the church, vocation is also a two-way discernment process, or three-way discernment process between the candidate, between the church and God. And the hope is, of course, that all three agree. That's the hope, of course, that both the candidate and the church have correctly discerned what God's vocation is for this particular individual, and then to realize, to facilitate and realize that vocation. Now, I say this because it is a very important aspect that many people who inquire don't always understand. Now, it can be difficult if you have felt a calling for a number of years, but perhaps by yourself. Perhaps you don't have a spiritual director. Perhaps you don't belong to a regular worshipping community. Then chances are that you have become your own, as it were, echo chamber. So that you've got this sense, this feeling that God is calling you, and it won't go away. But you perhaps haven't been able to share it and discuss that vocation with others. And so you've only got your own, as it were, input, and you haven't got an outside objective perspective. So that's one of the things that vocational discernment in partnership with the church is all about, is about the candidate being able to express what they sense and what they believe they're being called to, and for the church to assist and to help them in analyzing those feelings, analyzing that calling, looking at helping the candidate to look at their gifts, their talents, their skills, their abilities, their dispositions, etc., and to see and to recognize if that individual may indeed be called by God to a particular ministry like the sacred ministry. Now remember, our Lord himself says, many are called, but few are chosen. Many are called, but few are chosen. And that's another important thing to remember, that not everyone who sometimes senses that they may have a vocation to the sacred ministry necessarily does have a vocation to the sacred ministry. Indeed, part of the problem today is that generally so many people only talk about vocational discernment with regard to the sacred ministry, that various other callings sadly are ignored or obfuscated in somebody's discernment. You see, it may well be that somebody feels called by God to serve the church. And it may be that they are particularly gifted with pastoral skills, for example. That there may be that they're very compassionate. It may be that they perhaps they have trained already as a counselor. Perhaps they are a good listener. And all of those things are wonderful qualities, but they're not necessarily required for the sacred ministry. They would certainly be a help. And indeed, it's a great shame that more sacred ministers haven't got those particular skills or gifts or abilities. It's always a bonus when they do. But wanting to serve others is not the be-all and end-all of the sacred ministry. It's not the be-all and end-all of the sacred ministry. In fact, what perhaps is very shocking for many people to appreciate or understand or realize is that the priesthood itself is a particular vocation, which is not primarily focused on serving others in the general way that most people think it is or should be. Let me put that another way. That is to say, a priest is ordained really to offer mass and celebrate the sacraments. That essentially is the only difference between a priest and any other Christian. A priest is primarily called to pray on behalf of the church, for the church and with the church, to celebrate the sacred mysteries, and to be, as it were, the facilitator between the holy and us, to be a mediator, as it were, to be a bridge, to be the means by which God transcends our earthly existence and presents himself to us and makes himself available to us. So although somebody may have amazing pastoral skills and aptitude, although somebody may be a brilliant orator or preacher, though somebody may be an excellent theologian or philosopher, whatever, all of those things are wonderful, all of those in sacred ministry, but none of them are the point of what a priest is. Now, the thing is, of course, is that we have, generally, most of us have an understanding of the parochial office, meaning a parish priest. And of course, a good parish priest will be a pastor of souls and a shepherd to his flock. But in many ways, his priestly role is rather more limited than we might otherwise think. He exists primarily to be the conduit, as it were, between us and God and us. Which is not to say, of course, you can't get to God without him. Of course you can, and that God can't get to us without a priest. Of course he can. But in terms of the sacred mysteries, in terms of the sacraments, you need a priest. Remember, the Curé d'Ars, St. Jean Vianney, writes in his little catechism. He says that if he saw walking in the street a priest, an angel, or the Blessed Virgin Mary, that he would bow first to who? He would bow first in deference and respect to the priest. Because although the angel may indeed be a messenger of God, and indeed, although the Blessed Virgin Mary may be the most holy and perfect example of a Christian, only the priest can absolve sins. Only the priest can confect the Blessed Sacrament. Only the priest can command God to appear, as it were. So now, of course, we do want sacred ministers who are compassionate, who are good listeners. We do want sacred ministers who will be good preachers, good teachers, catechizers of the faith, catechists rather. We want all those other skills, of course. They are handy, but they're not ultimately what a priest is. So that's one of the things, that's one of the aspects, one of the perspectives that needs to be figured in the process, in the discernment process, is, as it were, trying to work out if the way in which the person feels called to serve God is necessarily to be a priest, or whether indeed they are called to serve God in other ways. And it's important to know that the discernment process begins looking at that question, because it may, of course, be a service to someone to have the help to realize that actually, no, God is not calling you to ordained ministry, but that he is perhaps calling you to religious life, or he is perhaps calling you to pastoral work, but under another guise, or that he is perhaps calling you to be an evangelist, or to be a missioner. Part of the problem that exists in the church today, and has done in recent years, is because of a dearth of vocations. Churches have all been really too quick to assume that when somebody comes forward and says, I feel called by God, to whip them straight away into an ordination route, rather than spend time discerning with them how and what exactly God may be calling them to. Because there are all sorts of ways in which any one of us can serve God. There are all sorts of ways in which the gifts, skills, talents, abilities, and dispositions God has blessed us with may be used. They are not all necessarily required or even desired for the priesthood or for the sacred ministry. And this, for example, may be discovered later on. One of the things, for example, that some clerics, a good indicator, as it were, of where perhaps an unfortunate decision was made in discernment, is when, for example, a cleric finds it very difficult to maintain the daily office. The daily office being, of course, the routine prayer of the church. So matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Now, the canon law requires that all clerics in major orders, which for Old Romans means from the subdiaconate onwards, they are canonically required to faithfully recite the daily offices. Now, we, of course, encourage those in discernment and those who become formally accepted onto the seminarial program to take up the daily office. And of course, there needs to be a time of adjustment. And there are various ways, we can teach how to adapt and how to incorporate the daily office into one's daily life. But if it's continually a problem, if it's something that somebody is continually struggling with, that may be an indicator then that the sacred ministry or the major orders are not going to be for them. Because it is a requirement, it is a part of being a priest, that one recites the prayer of the church, which is why one takes an oath, which is why it's canonically required. It's not an optional extra. It's not something that can just be, gotten rid of. But that doesn't mean to say that that individual isn't called by God to do something else. They may indeed, through the process, discover a deeper prayer life. But if commitment to the daily office is really too much, too difficult, in other words, if the inclination is just not there, if the desire is just not there, and so that's the other thing we have to be, that we try to discern in the process, is whether it's a genuine sort of disinclination, but one that could be gotten over with discipline, with self-discipline, or whether it's simply that somebody just doesn't want to do it. They just cannot do it. They just don't feel able to do it. In which case, that's probably an indicator that religious life or the sacred ministry is probably not for them. But that doesn't mean to say that God isn't calling them. It doesn't mean to say that he isn't calling them to something. And indeed, it may be to one of the minor orders. It may be that they will realize a ministry as an acolyte. See, this is something that Old Romans have retained vocationally, is the concept that some of the minor orders may be received, as it were, permanently. You see, so often we think of the minor orders as transitional. And of course, they are received transitionally, as it were, in a seminarian's progress toward ordination in the major orders. But it has long been the tradition of the church that some people were called simply to one or other of the minor orders, and that was that. They had found, as it were, their level. They had found their calling. So that some were called to the level of acolyte, some to lector, some to exorcist. And there is nothing wrong with realizing that one's vocation is simply to that level. Nothing wrong with that at all. And if anything, it could be of great service to the church for somebody to realize that their vocation is to be an exorcist, or is to be a lector, or is to be an acolyte. And it would be wonderful if then those orders, those minor orders, actually were themselves to be to develop and grow into a distinctive ministry, but a supportive ministry. I mean, ultimately, that's where they derive from. They are supporting roles, as it were, to the sacred ministry within the liturgical context. But also, too, they spoke to key roles within the Christian community, particularly in the early days. So, for example, porter, doorkeeper. Now, this is a role, for example, that in the Holy Land, if you go to Jerusalem and say, for example, to the Holy Sepulchre, you will find there a chap who is the doorkeeper to the Holy Sepulchre. You will be amazed to discover that he's a Muslim, and that for generations of his family, the men in his family for generations have been doorkeepers to the Holy Sepulchre. Now, don't worry, I'm not confusing that situation with a vocation to doorkeeper. I'm just simply making the point that actually that role was given in part because the Christians who shared the Holy Sepulchre couldn't agree on which one of their number should be the doorkeeper, the porter to the church. So to this day, the various different denominations that control the Holy Sepulchre, to this day, none of them have the key. None of them have the key. Instead, this chap from a family of generations of doorkeepers, he comes every morning and unlocks the great door, and he comes at every evening and locks the great door. And it just so happens that his family are Muslim and have been for generations. Now, but he is fulfilling a role that previously would have been filled by a Christian man who had discerned a vocation to be the porter, to be the doorkeeper. And it's clear from the liturgy of the minor orders that the jobs and the roles and the tasks had at one time greater importance. Now, if you can imagine the church, for example, in the mid to late 3rd century, there are two great bouts of persecution at that time, around 250 and then again around 300. The porter, the doorkeeper, they would have had a very crucial and important role, not just for opening and unlocking the church door to allow people in and out for divine service, but also to recognize who was a Christian, to recognize who was a member of that congregation, to recognize who was baptized and who was a catechumen, someone who was a convert being prepared for baptism. And they would have needed to fulfill this role because such was the level of threat and persecution that you wanted to be sure that only the right people came in. Now, of course, today we wouldn't necessarily need a porter to fulfill that role. But I already can conceive lots of different ways in which a porter's ministry could be developed and have greater significance in the life even of a local church community. To have somebody who would be responsible, yes, for the opening and closing of the door, for locking up, but in a broader sense for security. Somebody who perhaps then would be responsible for coordinating ushers. Somebody who would have the responsibility for coordinating with undertakers and wedding parties. For access in and out of the church, for preparations, etc. In many ways, within Old Romanism, there is the chance and the opportunity, which some are already developing, to realize once again the importance of the minor orders and to appreciate them as vocations of themselves and as valuable ministries of themselves, and get away from the kind of post-Trent conception of the minor orders as simply stepping stones for seminarians to go through on their way to the sacred ministry. You know, some people are not necessarily, many are called, but few are chosen. And it just may be that many of those in times past or recent history who were rejected for sacred ministry might actually have been suited for one of those supportive ministries. And of course, as well, it's true, no doubt, that many have been ordained to the sacred ministry who really shouldn't have been ordained for the sacred ministry, but should have been ordained to one of those, permanently to one of those supporting ministries. And again, in the wider context of the Christian community, the other thing to consider is that we all have this notion of the parish priest as being the kingpin in the parish, being the administrator, being the sole source of authority, to whom deferment and all decisions and deference should be made. In part because they are alter Christus, in part because they act in persona Christi, in part because they share in the bishop's teaching authority. But actually, somebody who is called to priesthood is probably not called to be a treasurer. They're probably not called or likely to have the skills necessary to be an accountant or even an office administrator. They may not be called necessarily to all sorts of other aspects of parochial ministry that the church, the wider church community in any location, in any parish, generally leaves to the priest. See, part of the problem today is, again, because this focus and concentration on ordination, what has been left and unexplored and developed is the notion of general Christian vocation, and the vocation that every Christian within every Christian community may have and be able to contribute towards the whole. So, for example, surely it makes more sense if there are Christians within the community who have a propensity for math, who perhaps are even chartered accountants or work in professional ways as administrators or accountants or bookkeepers or whatever. Well, perhaps that is a ministry then for the church that God has endowed them with those gifts and abilities with. And therefore they should be matched, as it were, to fulfill that kind of role within and for the local religious community. And that, of course, can be true for all the various other aspects of parochial administration that otherwise at the moment people tend to dump on the priest. Now, it may be that as a figurehead for the parish, it may be that he might need to be a rubber stamper, as it were, or to chair parish meetings. But actually, there are lots of aspects that go into functioning of a local church and of a functioning church community. There are roles that can be fulfilled and ought to be fulfilled by other Christians, not the priest. And one can't help but wonder sometimes that some of the issues that the church has had to endure over the years in terms of financial mismanagement and etc., and could have been avoided if greater emphasis had been made in catechesis for general Christian vocational discernment and for the recognition that particular individuals with the particular gifts and skills that they have, such that they've even perhaps developed them professionally in their professional lives, may actually be called by God to utilize those skills and abilities for the local church community. Wow, I know, radical, hey. But it just may be, surely. One thing we do know is not every man who is called to the priesthood is necessarily called to be nor blessed with the gifts, skills, talents, and abilities to be a good administrator. They're just not. You see, and it's not something, of course, it's not something that in formation discernment, that in vocational discernment, those sorts of gifts are not necessarily what those responsible for assisting candidates have been looking for in them. I mean, because why would they? Because that's not what a priest is ordained for. A priest is not ordained to be a bookkeeper. He's not ordained to be a church administrator. He's ordained to be a priest, primarily to pray. To pray and to administer the sacraments, to celebrate the sacred mysteries. So within discernment, within vocational discernment in Old Romanism, it is hoped that through the process, as it were, other vocations may be realized other than the sacred ministry. And those vocations will be honored, respected, and celebrated. And hopefully accepted by the relevant candidate. You know, it can be difficult for some people who have had fixed a notion in their head for years on their own to suddenly realize and discern within a partnered formation discernment process that actually what they thought God was calling to them to was not actually what he was calling them to. It can be sometimes difficult for them to accept that. And so again, you know, we hope and we try to make our discernment process fit to enable candidates to recognize and accept and acknowledge what may indeed be God's true vocation for them. Now, all of that you see is, I hope you can see and appreciate then, the necessity of all of that, because in terms of your discernment with us, it may be and hopefully you will too topple to it. It may be the sacred ministry is not your calling. That's not to say that ministries of all sorts of different kinds may be instead. And of course, one of the things it's wrong to think of and to approach a vocation to the sacred ministry is thinking that the sacred ministry is the be all and end all of it. Because, you know, one of the most endearing titles of the popes is that was adopted by St. Gregory the Great. Servum servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God. And really, a priest is called really to be a servant of the servants of God, to be himself like the servant king, to offer himself like Christ did, as a total offering of sacrificial love for God and for others. And so a vocation to the sacred ministry should not be thought of in terms of vocation to reach the top, or vocations to be top dog, or to be in charge of a parish or whatever. Should not be thought of in terms of hierarchical progression. Should not be desired in terms of wanting people to defer to you. Because one of the things, as I said to somebody recently, ordination doesn't confer, doesn't necessarily imbue the candidate with complete wisdom. It doesn't necessarily give them complete innate knowledge or understanding. All ordination does is set apart a particular individual to fulfill the particular vocation of a priest. So things then begin, our process begins in the first instance by a candidate making contact with us. As I said at the beginning, hopefully you've already visited this website, and the particular pages that you want to find and should read are where it says vocations. Now, of course, if you click on vocations, you should find there an introductory page which gives general information about sacred ministry within our communion. It gives direction there to discover more information about the religious life, and an invitation there to make contact. So you can fill in your name, email address, and then indicate, I have a vocation to religious life, I have a vocation to the sacred ministry, or I'm interested in incardination. That's if you're already ordained, but belong or have belonged to another church. But if you go back to the top where it says vocations, you see there is also a sub-menu, a drop-down menu. And at the top there it says discernment process, incardination, incardination form, and vocations info. If you click on vocations info, here, this is really where you will find general information about vocations within the communion. So here you can find information about discerning lay ministry, about some of the religious orders. Here, look, for example, the Franciscans, incarnation, sacred ministry, marriage and the clerical state, questions answered there. So that's all general information that should help you to sort of formulate, as it were, and discern for yourself your own vocation. Then if we return to the submenu and go to discernment process, here again is a general description of the discernment process, and it goes through the various stages. And you see that the first stage is getting to know each other. Getting to know each other. And again, their initial contact. So to begin the process of discerning a vocation within the communion, an applicant should make initial contact through correspondence. This may be using the contact form below, via email, via Facebook Messenger, or by mail. And then first response. Now it goes on there to describe what first response means. And what's important there to realize is that we adopt generally, as Old Romans, we have a kind of Benedictine approach to the initial stages of vocational discernment. If you're familiar with the rule of St. Benedict, you perhaps will already know that his advice concerning to the monks, concerning the reception of postulants, of prospective novices, is to try their patience. He says, essentially, let someone approach and knock on the door more than once. If they are persistent, then respond. Now, myself, and you may think it perhaps unfair or a little wicked, but generally speaking, I don't respond to the first contact that somebody makes. Because my feeling is that if they feel that God is really calling them to discern and explore their vocation with us, then they will return. And I say that because I get a lot of emails all the time from various individuals all around the world who tell me that God is calling them to the priesthood. And I can tell more or less from those emails that probably God isn't calling them, or certainly he isn't calling them to explore or discern their vocation with us. There are all sorts of indicators as to what that is, which I may share in another episode. But you know, not everyone who knocks on the door and says, I am called, is necessarily called. And quite frankly, we don't have the time, as it were, to immediately respond to all the messages that we receive, and especially when we know that most of them will be a waste of time. So if you're watching this and you have made an initial contact and you've not yet had a response, and you think, it's been a little while, the mistake to make is to think that we're disinterested. That's not the case at all. It just may be we're very interested, but we're waiting to see. We're waiting to see how committed, how called you feel you are to discerning your vocation with us. So if that resonates with you, and if you have no reason to think otherwise, that there should be any negative reaction from us to your approach, then I suggest you approach again. I suggest you knock again. Now, I know, of course, that may sound, I don't know, that may sound a bit harsh, but to be honest, we need to know, as it were, that God indeed may be calling you to explore your vocation with us. Archbishop Matthew's motto is, what God wills will be. What God wills will be. And if it is God's will for you to discern and realize your vocation with us, well, then you will feel motivated to contact us again, surely. No? And as I say, if you haven't yet made contact, then make contact. And if you don't get an immediate response, don't be shy in making contact again. And this is true for those at the very beginning of discerning their vocation, and for those who perhaps are already ordained in other jurisdictions, who are looking to incardinate with us. You see, from our perspective, we're not desperate for vocations. Actually, we are, but not in the way that phrase might normally suggest. We are desperate for the right people to explore their vocation with us. But we're not desperate for just anybody to come and discern their vocation with us. Do you see the subtle difference? Do you appreciate the subtle difference there? Because experience has taught us over the years that many are called, few are chosen. And we have seen our church and other churches suffer from the wrong people being chosen, when clearly, with retrospect and hindsight, they clearly shouldn't be. And so from the very beginning, we want to get things right. What God wills will be. So if you really think it is God's will that you should discern your vocation with us, then you will try and try again. And we will note and recognize and appreciate that perhaps then God is calling you to us. I suppose, if I may attempt to soften what I'm saying, everyone who does contact us is prayed for. Everyone, all those emails, everyone who does contact us is prayed for. I have a list myself of vocations, of names, and every Thursday I pray for those names. Every Thursday I pray for those names. And I look to see if any of those names come up, if any of those names return. And colleagues, of mine will tell you, I have a strange memory for names. I have a strange memory for names, but when it comes to names connected with vocation, I always remember. So I can look one glance at my emails, and I will recognize a name if it's on my vocations list. I will recognize a name if I've seen that name before in the context of vocation. So please understand, if you've contacted us and you've had no response, it doesn't mean we're disinterested. If anything, it probably means we are interested, but we are testing. We are discerning the spirit, and we hope you are too. And if it is God's will that you should discern your vocation with us, then you will contact us again. But meanwhile, we are praying for you. From that initial contact, you will be on my list of vocations. And indeed, if you're familiar with our weekly publication, I'll just see if I can bring it up here. So the Old Roman, which is an online magazine, newsletter, bulletin that is published every Sunday. So here, this is last Sundays for the Most Holy Trinity. If I click on that, and open it. Now, if I scroll down, if you're not familiar with this, then make yourself familiar, because it's packed full of interesting stuff. So as I scroll down, right towards the end, keep scrolling. Right towards the end, we have our intercessions list. I don't know if you can see that. Let me try that again. Okay, bear with me 1 second. There we go. Okay. So there you can see of your charity intercessions, and you'll see for those vocationally discerning. And you will only find Christian names, you won't find surnames as well. But these, for example, are people who have expressed in recent months an interest in discerning their vocation with us. So those people are being prayed for by Old Romans all around the world. So as I say, if you've made first contact but you've not had a response, then it may be that you need to try again. And not try again, but that it may be that you need to let us know that you are definitely interested, so that then we know, well, in fact, yeah, perhaps God is calling this person particularly to discern their vocation with us. Now, after the second or third attempt, you will then be responded to. So if I can find discernment process. Sorry, I'm getting confused now myself which screen I'm on. Here we go. Discernment process. Share. That's it. Okay. So first response. Depending on the vocation to be discerned, the applicant will receive a reply from somebody responsible, a contact assessor for that particular discernment. So, for example, some people, of course, are expressing an interest in baptism or confirmation. Some people are interested in volunteering. Some people are, of course, interested in holy matrimony. Some people are interested in the religious life or consecrated life. Some in the sacred ministry, and as I say, some already in the sacred ministry interested in incardination. But here, this section here tells you where your where your expression of interest, as it were, will be sent, and who will contact you. So as it says here, now what's key is that the first thing you will be asked for in all of the above scenarios, applicants will be asked for an account or description of their journey in faith. You know, in other words, what has led them to making contact with us. So a description of their spiritual and devotional life, e.g., their prayer life or rule of life. When and how did they begin to discern God's calling, and what their expectations are. Let me just highlight that there. So first contact, in all of the above scenarios, applicants will be asked for an account or description of their journey in faith. What has led them to making contact with us? Description of their spiritual and devotional life, prayer life, rule of life. How and when did they begin to discern God's calling, and what their expectations are? Okay, so just to recap, you make the first contact. You may need to make a second contact, but even after that first contact, we are already praying for you. But we're waiting, watching. So make another contact, a second contact. It may take a third. All that while, we are praying. All that while, we are watching for your name to come up again. Then we will respond. And the first thing we will ask you for is basically your personal account, your testimony of your faith journey so far and of your vocational discernment so far. Now, it may be your sense of vocation is relatively recent, or it may be that you've been discerning vocation for years. For example, some gentlemen, perhaps when they were very young, felt a calling to the sacred ministry, but through adolescence, early adulthood, perhaps they were diverted, their interest and energy digressed elsewhere, life took them in another direction. God took them in another direction. But perhaps later in life, circumstances have changed, things have changed. And thus, and that sense of that first calling, as it were, has returned. So in which case, we, of course, are desirous to know and understand all of that, in order for us to be able to help you, in order for us to be able to recognize how God may have been speaking to you throughout your life. You know, one of the perhaps differences between Old Romans and other churches is that we're not ageist. We're not ageist. If anything, we welcome mature vocations, because candidates, maturer candidates in years, of course, come with lots of life experience. And that's what we're curious to know about, asking for your faith journey, your faith story, your discernment process so far. And already we will be able to tell from what you have written whether or not, or where perhaps your vocation may be leading you to, if you want to go. And as I've already said before, that may not be to the sacred ministry, but our intention through this discernment process is to give us facilitation as we can, irrespective of the outcome. Okay, so if, for example, we think perhaps sacred ministry isn't the route, isn't the way, we're not just going to say to you, well, we don't think you're called to be a priest, so that's it. Rather, we will suggest to you, perhaps sacred ministry is not necessarily where God is leading you to or calling you to, certainly with us, but perhaps we can help you and give you pointers and continue to guide you in the realization of your vocation wherever else it may lead. And that really is our commitment, as it were, to this discerning process. You know, we don't care if at the end of the day sacred ministry may not be the object of your journey. We will support you nonetheless. I think that's, again, you know, that's one of the differences, again, that we offer the various other churches don't. I don't know how many people I've met over the years who began an ordination discernment process with a church. Ultimately, they were rejected, and they have felt rejected and dejected ever since. Even though, and what could have happened was somebody to have said, actually, maybe sacred ministry is not what God is calling you to, but have you considered, have you explored these other options? And we are prepared to make that commitment to those who feel called by God to discern their vocation with us. To our mind, this is you know, this is being responsible as the church. Okay, well, there's a lot there already of information for you to think about. So we'll draw things to a close there. Now, it's my intention to broadcast this series on Monday evenings, and later in the series we will interview other clergy. We will hopefully interview budding candidates. We will try to give a sense and a feel and a picture of discernment process within the old Roman tradition and communion. So, as I say, if you have made contact with us, know you are already being prayed for, but also know that we may still be waiting for you to contact us again. But discern in your heart whether that's right for you. But if you come back to us, we may well discern that perhaps God, this is right for you and for God and for us. Otherwise, if you are interested in vocational discernment generally, I would suggest going to oldcatholic.org, to the vocations pages, and look out there. I think on there is a series of vocational discernment videos that I recorded last year as part of a catechetical series, and that describes an approach that one ought to take spiritually in terms of discernment. So I commend that to you. Otherwise, feel free to come back next Monday, I hope, for the next installment, as I continue to try to share and explain formation and discernment for old Romans. So bless you for watching. Don't forget that if you have questions, you can contact us. Please feel free to do that. And we're here all week. There's a different show at 6:15 all week. So tune in and join us in fellowship through this lockdown, and as we all continue to discern God's will and purpose for our lives, sacred ministry or otherwise. Take care. God bless.